Richard Reed. Welcome to the Bookaholic Podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So, Bookaholics, today I'm going to be talking to Richard. He is the author of Charisma Unlocked: The Science and Strategy to Captivate, Influence, and Succeed in Business. Richard has spent his career coaching CEOs, entrepreneurs, and professionals to harness their authentic charisma and transform how they connect, lead, and inspire. In this interview, we're going to explore the myths, sciences, and strategies behind real influence and discover why charisma is not a gift, it's a skill that anyone can learn. So, Richard, let's dive into this because, when you look back at history, and I think about I never saw in real life John F. Kennedy. I was not born when John F. Kennedy was on the
Yeah.
earth. But so when we look at history and we hear about John F. Kennedy, one of the things that they say about him is that he had charisma, and his charisma ran over the bad black and white TV of the day. You about the historical debate between he and Richard Nixon. It was obvious that John F. Kennedy had charisma, and at that moment, Richard Nixon did not. So I never thought that charisma could be learned. I always assumed it was a gift of the glamorous or the gorgeous or the extra smart. So tell tell us, how did you come to the conclusion, or you and other scientists or whatever come to the conclusion that it can be taught?
Yeah. And I take your point. We tend to think about very famous people in the public eye, don't we, when we think about charisma? But in my experience and my research, it comes in all shapes and sizes. So that's really one of the big myths that we're looking to dispel, that it's only certain types of people that can be charismatic. And it probably is true that some people are born with more charisma than others. But I firmly believe, based upon having worked with multiple people over a number of years, that we can all move further along that continuum. And I think
Exactly.
the big thing is we tend to think it's about people who are very extrovert, people who are very out there, people who can be the
Yes.
life and soul of the party. And that is one
Yes.
form of charisma. But you can also have other forms of charisma, quiet charisma that makes people feel heard and validated. Um,
Um,
and that really sort of is more sort of inclusive. And one of the risks with extroverts is that sometimes they can be very entertaining, but they can also alienate other people. I've seen lots of examples, particularly sort of interviews where you've got a panel of people being interviewed on a chat show, and one person will thrive and other people will shrink because they feel overpowered by the person who's very extrovert. So it's really about recognizing what's going on in any given moment to include people and make people feel validated as well.
hmm I love what you just said, because that was one of my next questions. About people often, associate charisma with extroverts, but
They do.
introverts, which for some people is almost like a four-letter word. Some people consider,
Yeah.
oh, they're introverted, but I've seen in the last few years introverts take their power and say, just because we're introverts does not mean, basically that does not mean we're not valuable, so they go on to explain. But I love the fact that you say that there can be a quiet charisma in making people feel seen and heard. I love that. That's very impactful. So let's go down
Yeah.
that rabbit hole. So let's say today I'm listening to this interview and I consider myself an introvert. What steps would you give me towards being more of that nature of a quiet charisma?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, I'd say that wherever you are, whether you're extrovert, introvert, that there is always room for improvement. And in reality, very few of us have the ability to influence every situation that we're in. So being able to come outside of your comfort zone is really important.
Mhm.
But if you are an introvert, I think it's about recognizing that and playing to your strengths first and foremost. But it's also
Mhm.
about normalizing and validating that, because I think when I'm working with people, often introverts feel inferior. They feel I've got to
Yes.
be like that other person. And
Yes.
some of this is about recognizing who you are and leaning into that. So a big
Right.
part of charisma is about confidence and having the confidence to be who you are, and basically saying to the world,
Absolutely.
this is who I am, and
Absolutely.
I'm happy with that. And I think there's an attractiveness in that.
Absolutely. I think though, if I was sitting here today and if I was an introvert, just hearing you say that phrase would just turn a light bulb on, to let me know, hey, that's what I've been doing. I did not realize that was part of a charismatic, personality. Now let's go to the extroverts who have this charisma. And I think you and I discussed on the pre-call a little bit. Sometimes that charisma is associated with narcissism. So that's not the good, that's not the good charisma. So can
So
you
true.
explain that and give us some pointers on that?
Yeah, so the risk is, particularly, it can happen to anybody, but particularly if you're an extrovert, is that you can be very entertaining, but it's all about you. It's all about
Right,
look how wonderful I am, and
right.
sometimes even without intending to, as I mentioned before, you can overshadow and overpower other people. So the
Yes,
amount of energy that
absolutely.
you bring to an interaction needs to be valid and a benefit to the people that are there. And the risk is that often you'll get people who are very sort of bubbly and gregarious, but actually there's not a lot of depth there, and there's not a lot of
Yes,
interest in what's happening for other people. So it's about how do I use whatever energy I naturally have and calibrate that to bring other people into the situation. So when they come away from having interacted with me, not only do they think I'm wonderful, but they come away feeling good about themselves, and they carry that positive ripple out into the world.
yes, absolutely. That's a great way to put it. It is a great way to put it. Since narcissism is really on the spectrum these days, a lot of people are paying
Yeah,
attention to that. But anyway, but you also talk about four pillars of charisma: presence, power, warmth, and competence. Which one do
yeah.
most professionals tend to overlook, and why is it important?
Yeah, interesting question. I think, well, competency. I think most of us would agree that competence is important, and I think one of the criticisms that's often leveled at charisma is that it's smoke and mirrors, and there's not a lot of substance to it. So however charismatic you are, you've got to have competence behind it, because actually, otherwise,
Yeah,
it's short term, and people will see through that eventually. And there are lots of examples in
absolutely.
history of that. So competency, I think, it has got to be a given in all of this. But I think the one
Absolutely.
that is that they're all really important. But I think in terms of power, presence, and warmth, I think presence is the one that is often missing. And by presence, that covers a range of things. But part of it is about how much of yourself do you bring to interactions. So that could be, how authentic am I being? Going back to what we were saying before about introverts, am I being the person that I really am? Or am I showing people the parts of myself that I think fit with what I think they need from me? So leaning into who we are is really important. And you can be quite quirky, but you can also be charismatic. It's owning
Yeah,
it and being memorable for it. So that's part of it, but it's also about the amount of focus that we're bringing to situations. So I could be having a
absolutely.
conversation with you, but I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. How am I coming across? And not thinking about how is that landing? What do you need from me?
Yes,
Yeah, and how often
absolutely.
is our mind fragmented? We're thinking about the 20 things we've got to do after this conversation. So, bringing yourself back into the moment is really important in terms of managing your own emotions so you can make informed choices, but also so you make people feel heard and seen. And this is really important. We've got to validate other people, make them feel important, not more important than us, but as important as us.
That's so I hate to repeat myself. It's so beautifully said, and it's such a message that
Thank
we
you.
need right now. And one of the things though, with what you just said, there requires some emotional intelligence
It
behind the
does.
person. So if you're not a substantive person at all, how can you bridge a person who doesn't have that emotional intelligence, and bring them down this path? What can
Yeah.
we do with those folks? Because there's a lot of them out there.
Yeah. 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 Good question. I think there's a few things. I think when we think about charisma, we think about external behaviors. What do I say?
Yeah.
How do I say it? How do I use my body? And that,
Yeah.
there's no getting away from the fact that's important. But if you learn that in a rote fashion, that's going to seem artificial. And if I think about, I'm from the UK originally. If you think about UK politicians, and I think
Right.
it's the same in the States and probably most other places, they learn a set of mannerisms, and the risk is
Yeah.
that people don't trust it because it's too polished and it
Yeah.
doesn't match with what's going on behind the scenes. So it actually works against them. So I think
Right.
that the first thing really is about getting in control of your own emotions. When you're in control of your own emotions, you are no longer driven by your emotions. Or if you are, you can recalibrate much quicker. If you're driven
Yeah.
by your emotions, you're not making informed choices about how you want to come across, how you want to use those external skills. But also, you've got less capacity to recognize what's going on for other people. And the really charismatic people, as you say, they're emotionally intelligent. They can read in real time what's happening for people, whether they're on the right track, whether they need to recalibrate, whether they need to check in with people, all those kinds of things. That's really important, and tapping in to the emotions that sit behind what people say. So it's not enough just to say, well, I remember what they said. What does it mean
Right.
to that person? If you can understand what something means and you can demonstrate to them that you know what it means, then they're more likely to trust you. They're more likely to feel aligned. So we're trying to create
Right.
win-win situations. So I've got an agenda, but I understand what your agenda is, and we're trying to work in an authentic way to bring these things to get together as much as possible. So
Oh,
all of that is
absolutely.
really, really important. But if you're not emotionally intelligent, one of the things that you can do, as well as building your self-awareness of what's going on for you, is to
Mhm.
start to glean feedback from people. And that can be really uncomfortable.
It
Asking
can.
people how you've come across, watching
Right.
back videos of yourself. It's
Yes.
uncomfortable. Most people shy away from it, but these are the ways that we can fast track that learning and that insight.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, absolutely. Now, well, chapter 4 dives into storytelling. So, in a business context, how can someone turn a mundane message into a magnetic narrative?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's one that people tend to shy away from. But actually, if you think about the human experience, we've got a range of modalities by which we interpret the world. But the most popular one is visual. So it's estimated that 70% of the population, their preferred modality in terms of how they experience the world and think about things is visual. So they have pictures when they think about things. So creating stories, creating metaphors is a really shorthand, effective way of making our story memorable. And if you imagine for a moment, one of the things I talk about with people is this idea of a brand. We all have a personal brand, and stories are an extension of that brand. And when we're talking to people, they are in essence our marketing team. The messages that we give them, how much those messages resonate with them, how much they remember, is how effective the marketing is that they do about us and what's important to us. So giving them the tools to do that is really, really important. So storytelling, metaphors is a great way of bringing things alive because it taps into emotions.
Right.
Yeah, and we tend to be quite good at giving people facts, particularly within the business world, thinking about the content of what we want to deliver, but we don't think about how that resonates with people on an emotional and a sensory level. And if you
Right.
think about, I'm not sort of going to put you on the spot now, but if you think about some of the experiences you've had in life, perhaps, or I've had in life, we don't necessarily remember the words that people have said to us, but we often
Right.
remember the emotion that was evoked by that, and it will conjure up pictures, some snapshots of that incident. So
Yes.
this is why it's really, really important. You think about how we get across to small children. We often do it through
Yes.
the medium of story, and as adults, we
Yeah.
lose sight of that. Actually, in essence, we're just sophisticated children, really. We look a bit
Right.
older on the
Right.
outside and we've got a bit more experience, but
Right.
that's essentially how we interpret the world.
Wow, absolutely. Something you said just a few seconds ago reminded me of the Maya Angelou quote, and I may be
Exactly.
saying it,
No, this is
but
spot on. This is spot on. Yeah,
you may not remember what someone said to you, but you sure do remember the way they made you feel. That's not the
exactly.
exact words of her quote, but it's something along those lines. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Perfect. Perfect advice. Now, there's also another fascinating chapter on anti charisma. So, what is that, and how can being
Yes.
unconventionally charismatic be just as effective?
Yeah. Well, think about charisma. We tend to think about charisma as always about being liked and being popular, but it's also, again, going back to this idea of branding. It's about being memorable.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're trying to be something that you're not, that's really hard to sustain. It's also tends to be obvious to other people, so actually backfires. So if you think about some of the people who have a very strong brand, they are quirky, they are unusual.
Right.
That's part of why we remember them. We may like
Right.
them for it, we may not, but we tend to respect the fact that they stand for something. And so that
Right.
respect element is just as important as being popular. So those
Right.
people who lean into that, and effectively say, "This is who I am, and I'm happy with that," they tend to be more consistent in terms of how they come across, and that consistency is really important in terms of making them memorable, in terms of other people being able to talk about them in shorthand, but also it affords them respect. And
Right.
all of those things are really, really important. So, there's lots of examples, and I guess particularly with it, not so much within politics, but, you think about the music industry, there
Mm-hmm.
are definitely lots of examples of one-offs, aren't there? So, let's think of some examples. So Prince, Boy George, whole range of people who,
Mm-hmm.
they're not the typical people you see going down the street.
Right. Right.
And,
Right.
and so we're drawn to that confidence. We're drawn to people who are
Right.
confident. We're drawn to people who are consistent in their behavior. That
Right.
consistency appeals to something which is sort of deep at the heart of human psyche, which is trust and safety. So even if
Right.
somebody's unusual, if they are consistent in how they come across, we tend to trust them more. Whereas if
Yes.
somebody's a chameleon, they're different in different situations, or depending on which day we catch them, we don't know
Right.
where we stand with them.
Right.
So we tend to be
Right.
a little bit more wary of them. So
Wow.
that's what we mean by anti-charisma, not what you would
Yes.
sort of think about in terms of your typical politician or movie star.
Yes, yes, yes. That was a great example of Prince and Boy George. I'll throw in one for you, Ozzy Osbourne, who just passed away this week.
It,
But that,
exactly, from
people,
my hometown. Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
wow.
yeah. From my
Yeah,
hometown.
yeah,
So yeah, one off.
yeah,
You imagine
absolutely.
somebody trying to replicate that, they probably couldn't. They wouldn't do it. He's a one-off individual, but he's memorable.
Absolutely.
He captures something.
Absolutely.
People admire that.
Right, absolutely. I mean, and just to use him as an example, he was very prominent in my growing up. I never listened to his music or anything like that, but I still knew fully about him and what he was
Exactly.
about.
Exactly. There's a brand there, isn't it? And I'd say he's pretty. He's dead now, but he was pretty authentic. What you got was who he was.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, shared several business case studies from Starbucks to Ford. So, what's one story that really encapsulates the practical impact of charisma in a high stakes business scenario?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots. I guess that the one that sort of most springs to mind is somebody like Richard Branson. So I
Mm,
think there's an element of sort of design and PR to it, but essentially he's a go getter, and you
yes,
think about, not so much now, he's getting on a little bit in age, but some of the things that he's done over the years. So hot air balloon across the Atlantic, trying
yes,
to set up a Coca-Cola business to compete with Coca-Cola and Pepsi.
yes,
All
yes,
these kinds of things. That there's it's an element of the modern day explorer and adventurer about it, and there
yes,
is something that appeals to people about that, and people are energized by that and drawn to it. So you think about some of the people that he rubs shoulders with. As a business
right,
person, it's not the sort of typical people that you would expect them to mix with. Pop stars,
mm,
sports people, but people are drawn to it because they see that dynamism, and people want to be a part of that. So we're drawn to
right.
people who we think have the ability to influence situations, but also have the warmth and the interest in other people that think actually that they're going to take us with them.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just think about him when you mentioned his name, when he, I guess, was presented in America, so to speak, probably was a teenager. So you had on one hand described a self-made man, a great businessman, and then he was,
Exactly,
like
which
you
people
said,
admire straight away. Yeah,
a modern day explorer with bravado. Yeah, he's
yeah,
yeah, that's a great example. And
yeah.
so
A
if a
disruptor in
reader,
effect. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. So, but if a reader takes only one actionable thing from Charisma Unlocked, what would you want that to be and how they can apply it tomorrow morning?
So I think one of the things that would be really helpful in terms of starting off with all of this stuff is to start to recognize your brand. So think about the situations where you thrive, where people are drawn to
Mhm.
you. And if you're feeling really brave, ask some of the people who you come into contact with on a regular basis. And what you'll probably find is there are a series of common elements that they give you in terms of your feedback. And that is the core of your brand. It's not to say you can't expand that, but that is the core of your brand. And when you become aware of that, you can start to lean into it and make it a more consistent part of who you are. So I would
Absolutely.
say start to think about yourself as a brand, because when we don't, we tend to be haphazard and inconsistent in terms of how we come across. The more we have a brand, when we start to deviate from that, we can start to recognize it much earlier and recalibrate if we need to. So that's how you
Absolutely.
start to get more credibility and really build your charisma.
Wow. Richard Reed, this is one of the best interviews I've ever had, in the fact that I think it's
Thank
so
you.
impactful and helpful to people worldwide. Thank goodness I have a worldwide audience. Richard Reed, thank you so much for joining the Bookaholic Podcast today. I really appreciate you. And Bookaholics, we will have Richard's information in the podcast show notes as well as in the video description box. Richard, once again, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.